The Supreme Court strikes down Donald Trump's emergency tariffs in a 6-3 ruling that enforces the separation of powers and says the president does not have unbounded authority to tax imports on a whim. Will the White House try to reimpose Trump's tariffs using other laws? And would it be wiser to hold off as new figures Friday show economic growth going down and inflation going up?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the WSJ's opinion pages, columnists Alicia Finley and Joe Sternberg. For months, the president has been collecting billions of dollars of tariffs on a dizzying range of products and countries whenever the spirit moves him to announce new rates. The law that the White House has often resorted to is the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, which lets a president in a national emergency investigate, block, regulate, direct, compel, nullify, void, prevent, prohibit, and so on and so forth. Acquisitions, holdings, withholdings, transfers. It has often in the past been used as a sanctions law, and now a 6-3 majority of the Supreme Court, an opinion by Chief Justice John Roberts, says that it does not include the power to tax imports in the broad sort of fashion that President Trump has been trying to do. Here is a piece of the opinion. The facial breadth of regulate places in stark relief what the term is not usually thought to include taxation. The U.S. Code is replete with statutes granting the executive the authority to regulate someone or something, yet the government cannot identify any statute in which the power to regulate includes the power to tax, unquote. Alicia, what do you make of this major ruling by the Supreme Court, maybe a landmark?
Right. So the Supreme Court, in this case, both applied the statutory tax as well as its major questions doctrine to hold that this broad language that says or provides for the power to quote unquote regulate importation or exportation does not cover the power to tax or to tariff. Now, the Chief Justice, in his opinion, goes through the various reasons under the major questions doctrine, citing some other previous opinions going back actually to the Clinton years when the FDA tried to regulate tobacco as a drug, and then cites some other decisions, including the West Virginia v. EPA decision from a few years ago, that in which the Obama administration tried to essentially close a lot of fossil fuel plants and claim these vast sweeping powers under the Clean Air Act to force the green energy transition to renewables. He also points to the student loan forgiveness, the Biden administration's, as well as the eviction moratorium, the Biden vaccine mandate by OSHA. And he actually says that, well, what Trump is claiming here is even more sweeping than any of those decisions, because even by the Trump administration's lights, it could have a $4 trillion impact. Now, recall that the Biden administration's loan forgiveness was estimated about $430 billion, just to put those the significance, the economic significance in perspective. Not only that, the Constitution expressly vests in Congress the power to tax, the power of the purse. And what the president or Trump did here really is usurp that power that was expressly delegated to, or expressly provided to Congress. And that also distinguishes it from some other kind of foreign policy cases that the dissent points to to support their argument that there's some kind of exemption here from the major questions doctrine, which we could get into a little later.
The dissent for 3 conservative justices is written by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and he makes the argument that, like quotas and embargoes, tariffs are a traditional and common tool to regulate importation. And here's another piece of his dissent. He says, since the founding, numerous statutes have authorized and still do authorize the president to impose tariffs and other foreign import restrictions. IEEPA merely allows the president to impose tariffs somewhat more efficiently to deal with foreign threats during national emergencies, unquote. And Joe, part of what I don't find persuasive about that is you can look in IEEPA for any sort of guidance, limitations that Congress would put on this claimed presidential authority, which often exists in other tariff statutes. You have a tariff statute, and Congress says if there is a national security threat, write a report and explain why it's a national security threat, and then you can impose a tariff. Or there are laws that provide tariff authority for a certain time period, or rate limitations, and that is not in evidence in IEEPA at all, which is part of what the majority is pointing to. And as an example, let's listen to President Trump talking on Fox Business about how he came to a 39% rate on Switzerland recently.
Then I got an emergency call from, I believe, the Prime Minister of Switzerland, and she was very aggressive, but nice, but very aggressive. Sir, we are a small country. We can't do this. We can't do this. I couldn't get her off the phone. We are a small country. I said, you may be a small country, but we have a $42 billion deficit with you. No, we are a small country. Again and again and again. I couldn't get her off the phone. So it was at 30%. And I didn't really like the way she talked to us. And so instead of giving her a reduction, I raised it to 39%.
Joe, I think that just underlines the open-ended view that the Trump administration advanced here about its powers under IEEPA, which, remember, is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And if it allows the president to impose tariffs on a whim for any reason or no reason at all, including that the prime minister or the president of such and such country was really annoying to me on a phone call, that is a really breathtaking delegation by Congress to the president of the United States on the taxing of imports. And I think that context may help explain why the majority, including the three conservatives and Chief Justice Roberts, did what it did.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to Justice Kavanaugh's point in the dissent, there's a very good reason that Congress does not want this tariff power to be efficiently exercised by the president. And, that interview with President Trump that we've just heard a clip of is the perfect example of that. I mean, actually, it's an interesting contrast to all of the other parts of the law that do allow an administration, under the leadership of the president, to impose tariffs on particular goods or particular industries, because Congress historically has imposed a lot of restraints on that. Congress requires the administration to undergo a long, often cumbersome administrative research phase, to take in a lot of input from various affected industries and investigate the marketplace before you reach some kind of conclusion about whether you're going to impose some of the tariffs on particular goods. And I would argue that the reason for that is that lawmakers, especially over the course of the 20th century, realized that protectionism is not a political winner in the U.S. It's one of those things, kind of like the weather, where everyone likes to talk about it, but at the end of the day, you don't do anything about it. I think that there was this understanding developed, especially after the 1930s, that free trade was good for the American economy, and that generally a free trade policy represented a bunch of trade-offs about consumption, production, investment, all of the rest of it that the American voters were prepared to make. So, you often have legislation that creates the ability for tariffs that you might pass as a sort of political show to suggest that you're doing something about it in response to some political pressures here or there for more protectionism. But the intent is usually to limit that power. And when you look at how disruptive the Trump tariffs over the past year have been to the economy, the effects that they're having on a lot of industries, including the companies that filed the lawsuit that the Supreme Court has just decided, who were very negatively affected by these capricious tariffs. You can understand why this is actually a very sensitive economic issue, and that makes it sensitive politically. And the genius of our constitutional system for 200 plus years has been understanding that the more delicate that kind of balancing is, the less suitable it is to hand off to one person in the form of the president.
It is a victory, I think, for the separation of powers, which is something that in recent years the Supreme Court has been more active about policing. I think for good reason. We live in an era of congressional acquiescence and executive overreach. And on that point, Alicia, one more conversation issue on the opinion itself. You mentioned the major questions doctrine, which is often how the Supreme Court is now framing its choices in striking down these aggressive uses of executive power. Essentially, the major questions doctrine is the Supreme Court saying if there is some large policy choice, then Congress needs to clearly hand that off to the President of the United States. The President cannot hide an elephant in a mouse hole, as the phrase often has it. And what's interesting here is there are three conservative justices who say that this IEEPA tariff issue squarely is a major questions problem. The three conservative justices in majority say that this IEEPA tariff question falls squarely within the major questions doctrine. The liberals do not want to join that section of the opinion. But then there's also just debate in some concurrences after the opinion about what the major questions doctrine is, what it should look like. Justice Neil Gorsuch making an argument for kind of a strong substantive version of it that the Supreme Court needs to require real clear statements by Congress. Justice Barrett saying the major questions doctrine, in her view, is just the basic mode of textualism. She, in an opinion, recently raised the idea of a babysitter. If your parents are at home with a babysitter and they hand a credit card to the babysitter and say, make sure the kids have a good night. If the babysitter goes to an amusement park 2 states away, that would be a major question that is not considered in the context of see you later, here's the credit card. Alicia, what's your read of this debate and what this suggests about how the Supreme Court may use the major questions doctrine and police the separation of powers in the future?
Well, I think you're definitely seeing some fractures among the conservatives on the court on this issue. Neil Gorsuch kind of chided Amy Coney Barrett and took apart her example and said, well, this actually, your example of the babysitter doesn't really would allow the government to do all kinds of things nonetheless. And this idea that, well, it's just a matter of common sense and communication, well, that doesn't really answer a lot of questions. He also, by the way, skewered even more the liberal concurrence, and including Elena Kagan, who has been very critical of the major questions doctrine in the past and has claimed that, well, it's really just an anti-administrative state stance and prevents Congress from using the executive branch to perform quote unquote important work, and that it was essentially magically appeared. So he hoist the liberals on their contradictions. Now, I think what you see with the conservatives, in this case, Clarence Thomas, who wrote a separate dissent, but also joined Brett Kavanaugh and Alito, Samuel Alito, in a dissent. They say, well, the major questions doctrine could apply, but we think in this case, the statute actually clearly provides the authority to impose tariffs under the terms of quote unquote regulate importation. Now, we can address why that isn't the case. And as the Chief Justice points out, that the Constitution would prevent or bars the imposition of tariffs on exports, clearly. So if the IEEPA really does what the dissent claims it does, it would be unconstitutional. The conservatives also kind of make an exception or try to argue for an exemption in the realm of foreign policies. This touches foreign policies, and they cite several precedents in the Supreme Court precedents about the court not trying to interfere in the president's exercise of foreign policy powers. But as Justice Gorsuch notes that, well, these are actually overlapping powers for Congress and the president. So those precedents don't actually neatly apply. And as the Chief Justice underscores again and again in his opinion, these implicate the power of the purse and the power of taxation. I think there could be a little bit of politics motivating some of the conservatives and a little irritation at the liberals who have been somewhat contradictory in how they have applied the major questions doctrine in the past. But I think they are also trying to kind of square some other kind of difficult precedents, the Algonquin decision, which Justice Gorsuch points to, which implicated the 1962 Trade Act in Section 232 that allowed the president to impose licensing fees. And how is that any different than a tariff and all of that? Though I think the chief does address that in his opinion too, and notes that, well, actually Section 232 does mention imports and duties, even if it doesn't expressly note that or doesn't expressly authorize the president to impose tariffs. So I think what we're seeing here is some fractures among the conservatives on this particular case and how they read the text. But I don't necessarily think there are broader issues or broader dissents on the major questions doctrine is now the law of the constitutional law of the land.
Turning to how President Trump might respond to this ruling, as we tape this, there is no Truth Social post yet. I keep hitting refresh on that, but some reports that President Trump has called the decision a disgrace in private meetings. But Joe, the Trump administration, the White House seems to have been a bit on defensive about its tariff policies lately. There was recently a study done by 4 researchers at the New York Federal Reserve, and they came to the conclusion by looking at import prices that nearly 90% of the tariff's economic burden last year fell on U.S. firms and consumers. Let's listen to White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett responding to that this week on CNBC.
The paper is an embarrassment. It's, I think, the worst paper I've ever seen in the history of the Federal Reserve System. The people associated with this paper should presumably be disciplined because what they've done is they've put out a conclusion which has created a lot of news that's highly partisan based on analysis that wouldn't be accepted in a first semester econ class. The bottom line is that if you're wondering like who bears the burden of something, of a tariff, then you remember, Joe, you got supply curves, demand curves, you shift them around, you got consumer surplus, you got producer surplus, and then you look and see how it all works out in the end. And they're basically only looking at changes in prices. So they're assuming that quantities don't move at all. But guess what? Quantities did move at all.
Joe, what do you make of that response, particularly given that this research by the Federal Reserve in New York generally accords with what many other studies and papers have found, that the tariffs are not being paid by foreigners, as President Trump often claims, but the bulk of them are falling on U.S. companies, U.S. consumers?
Well, I mean, look, let's think about this in terms of the reaction to the Supreme Court's ruling on this. I mean, Trump is obviously going to be unhappy about this. There will inevitably be a Truth Social post. And Kyle, if you are refreshing that page, you deserve hazard pay for reading it. But I think that on sober reflection, if that is possible within this Trump White House, people are going to realize that this ruling is probably the best thing that has happened to Republicans since the 2024 election. I think that they have an enormous economic problem with the tariffs, and so far as the tariffs are creating a headwind for economic growth. I mean, certainly the GDP data over the past year have been okay. The labor market isn't fantastic, but it also hasn't fallen off of a cliff. There's some evidence that inflation is moderating a bit, particularly more recently. That is all happening despite the tariffs, not because of the tariffs in the way that the Trump administration wanted to claim. And in fact, I mean, regarding Kevin Hassett's claim that this all works out great for the economy and the consumers, that is completely contrary to the rationale for the tariffs themselves. I mean, the more honest intellectual defenders of this policy all along have argued that they are trying to make things more expensive for American consumers and give them less choice, because that is the way that you're supposed to rebalance the global economy through the tariffs. So the political problem with this is that it's not popular, which is why, despite periodic episodes over the years where there will be debates about tariffs or protectionism or the evils of free trade, the policy outcome is generally different. And I think that's because lawmakers realize that their constituents want the kind of economy that you have when you have free trade. And so the Supreme Court is just creating an opportunity now for the Trump White House and congressional Republicans to deliver that despite themselves, by not having to dicker around with these capricious Trump tariffs anymore. And that should allow them to sidestep all of these debates about the economic research on this. I mean, you're right, Kyle, the research is pretty unanimous about the distribution of the costs of the tariffs, and that is because the tariffs only work if they are making things more expensive for American consumers. So surprise, surprise, that's what the research is tending to find. And that is the key to the political vulnerability that the tariffs were creating. And now, thanks to the Supreme Court, that is off the table.
On this point about the economy and how shaky it might be looking, a couple of new figures out Friday. Here are the top of two Wall Street Journal stories. U.S. gross domestic product rose at a 1.4% seasonally adjusted annual rate in the final quarter of last year. Economists surveyed by the Journal had expected 2.5%, so a real shortfall there. And then the Fed's favorite inflation rate, the personal consumption expenditure, is up 0.4% in December. That is double the November increase of 0.2%. So, Alicia, this is the economic environment that Republicans are looking around at as they consider that we are now only several months from these midterm elections that are going to decide whether Republicans keep the House, keep the Senate, or lose those to Democrats, how the final 2 years of President Trump's second term are going to play out. And he does, if he wants to reimpose these tariffs through other means, have options to him. Why don't you talk a little bit about what the limitations are, or whether if President Trump decides that he really wants to keep going down this tariff path, we're just going to spend the next months talking about Section 232, Section 301, Section 338, and maybe more.
So I put a giant asterisk on the GDP report because federal government spending, because of the shutdown, actually subtracted 1.15 percentage points from it. So you'd probably have had a 2.6% reading if not for that. The consumer spending came in a little slower, but it was still very strong in the quarter. I think what we did see is a continued kind of slowdown in investment overall, and that does raise, or business investment as well as housing investment, that does raise some concerns. As for the inflation, that diverges from the Bureau of Labor Statistics' latest CPI report, which actually showed that inflation is starting to slow down. Again, they have different ways of calculating inflation, or the Fed actually puts less emphasis on housing, which has been a key source of disinflation in recent months. All which is to say that the data is really noisy right now. But what we do know is that Americans are not happy about how Trump is handling the economy. In part, that is owing to his tariffs. They can kind of connect the dots, and they know when you impose tariffs, these tariffs are essentially taxes, and they will and are contributing to higher prices, at least at the margins. And in many cases, they're compressing profit margins of small businesses and making it harder for them to hire. And so I think that they have contributed to some of the slowdown in the labor market there. To your question about, well, what is President Trump going to do? Well, I think you've already seen him rolling out more tariffs under the Section 232 authorities that do provide him the power to impose tariffs for national security reasons. You've seen him use 232 for lumber. He's increased the tariff rate for up to 50% for steel and aluminum. He's imposed tariffs under 232 for autos and auto parts. He's done an investigation for computer chips, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. He's tried to expand the Section 232 to apply to derivative parts of things, so like wood and cabinetries, kitchen cabinets, or for that matter, baby strollers. So he's already utilizing a lot of power, tariff power. Has Section 301 that he's already been using, and he used during the first term to impose hefty tariffs on China. And so I think you will continue to see that. I don't think the Congress is going to necessarily give him more tariff authority or impose the tariffs. I think they realize that this is very unpopular. And they're probably breathing a sigh of relief after the court's decision today.
One more fresh of the web browser, but it seems we are still waiting on the Truth Social post. So that means, Alicia, you get the last word today. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for listening. You can email us your own tariff reactions to pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.